today we are going to be talking about the importance of failure as kind of a learning process and part of the learning process. And I have here with me someone who's written quite a bit about that in a lot of different areas of life, politics, economics, things like that. We have journalist Megan Mcardle with us. So let me introduce Megan, and then we'll get into some of the questions and interview stuff. Okay, so Megan Mcardle is currently a Bloomberg View columnist who writes on economics, business, and public policy. In 2014, she wrote a really amazing book called The Upside of Down: Why Failing Well is the Key to Success. Mcardle previously wrote for Newsweek, The Daily Beast, The Atlantic, and The Economist. She founded the blog Asymmetrical Information. She has a bachelor's degree in English literature from the University of Pennsylvania and an MBA from the University of Chicago, and currently lives in Washington. So Megan Mcardle, it's absolutely a thrill to have you with us today.
Thrilled to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Sure. So your research obviously is on a lot of different areas, very wide-ranging, economics, public policy. But when I've read your books and some of your articles, you do have a lot to say about the education process, presumably because learning to fail and having the space and comfortability to fail starts with early education. So I guess the best place to start is here. Early in your book, The Upside of Down, you talk about this new generation of college kids going into jobs. And a lot of the complaints are that these kids are a little bit kind of different. They're maybe more fragile than some of the other kids in past generations. And you talk about asking around to people who, hire in companies and things like this. And they say, yeah, indeed, the new generation is a little bit different than past generations. You say this, today's new graduates may be better credentialed than previous generations and are often very hardworking, but only when given very explicit directions, and they seem to demand constant praise. So what do you mean by that, and what do you think is the relationship between that and students maybe being less comfortable to fail?
So I think that, at this point, you're even hearing it fascinatingly. You're hearing it from people, new college grads who are saying, God, those people who started college in class of in 2014, those people are really different from us. So it seems to be accelerating whatever it is. But I'll say that I think, when I grew up, I had a phenomenal amount of autonomy, despite the fact that I grew up in New York City when it was actually really dangerous. I grew up in New York in the 70s and 80s, which was pretty much at the peak of the crime wave in the city. I was allowed to roam around the city starting, I would walk 4 miles home from church on Sundays with my best friend when I was 10 years old. My best friend actually got on a crosstown bus by herself at the age of 6. By the time we were 12, we would go down to Macy's and do our own school shopping. There was just a phenomenal amount more autonomy that we had when we were kids. And the stakes were not nearly as high as in our education. Now, I went to actually what is now familiar from a lot of articles that everyone's read. I went to this kind of high-pressure private school where they really focused on getting you the extracurriculars and the grades and so forth to prepare you for an elite school. Even with that said, the amount of pressure that I was under is so much less than a kid at a kind of median suburban public school now. To get into a good college, to endlessly groom yourself. Well, what does this do? So on the one hand, we're actually restricting the kind of physical autonomy of kids an enormous amount. They just don't have the amount of free time and the amount of free space that kids my age did, either in the suburbs or in the cities. Now, my friends in the suburbs weren't taking the subways, but they were riding their bikes around, something that no parent would let their kid do now. Oh, yeah, I'm just going to the mall 8 miles away. It was a normal thing for a 10 or 12-year-old kid to be doing in 1982, and it's seen as criminal behavior in 2016. So that's part of it. And then there's the educational part of it, which is that the stakes are seen as being so high that everyone's parents have to get in and manage them from a very young age through this process of, when you fought with a teacher, and again, I'm at an elite private school where the parents are certainly consumers. They're paying a lot of money for this education, but when a teacher flunked me and it was unfair, and it was unfair, I'm still nursing it after all these years. When it happened, my parents were like, well, you're going to need to learn to deal with authority at some point, so you better figure it out. That is an inconceivable conversation to have now because the stakes are so high that parents feel like they can't do that. They need to get in and manage the process. So in the end, what you end up with is kids who spend an enormous amount of time focusing on this one activity, which is providing adults with exactly what they want from you. This incredibly structured process where an adult demands something and then you give it to them, back to them the way they've set up the rules. So we're creating conformity outside of the educational system. We are restricting the normal spaces where kids used to learn to try stuff and do stuff that was a little dangerous. The monkey bars when I was growing up were 6 or 8 feet high and had concrete under them. Now they're 2 feet high and they have padding. And you would think that that would actually make kids less afraid, more able to go out into the world because they haven't had these terrible falls. But it turns out that psychological research shows the opposite, is that the people who are most afraid of heights are the people who haven't fallen. Because once you've done it, you have the measure of it. Oh, well, that hurt. It does hurt, right? And there were kids who broke their arms, kids who, my sister got hit in the head with a metal swing and had to have 90 stitches or something ridiculous. But, and is a totally normal functioning society, member of society today. She works for the government. But all of these things were just a normal part of childhood back then, and people learned not to be so afraid of getting hurt because they did all the time. Now there's this incredibly sheltered process. It makes people more fearful, not less, when they've never taken risks and never gotten the measure of what it feels like to fail. And so the kids who aren't allowed to fail in the system, who don't explore, who don't try things that they aren't really good at and find out eventually that they don't, those kids with the stakes so high on success, we're not letting kids fail. Well, ultimately, when they get to a situation they don't recognize before, when they get into the workplace especially, where no one's providing you with 7 structured tasks that have to be done exactly one way, those kids really don't know what to do and they're lost.
Right. It's interesting because as a college teacher and a former high school teacher, one of the problems I've always had a love-hate relationship with the rubrics that we're supposed to, for assignments, give students a rubric that shows them exactly what kind of they're supposed to do. And the good thing about it is it's objective. Students know exactly how they're going to be graded and exactly what the project should look like. But of course, the bad thing is that it also predetermines for them exactly what the project should look like. So I've taken recently to not giving rubrics and telling students, figure out the project that works for you. And often that's a hard process for students because they're very used to, at this point, being told exactly what the project is supposed to look like.
And one thing that we should say is that this is not just insanity on the part of teachers or on the part of parents, is that they're responding rationally to incentives. Parents are responding to the fact that this generation is a huge generation. So my generation had like 45 million kids in it. This generation has like 8 million kids in it. And so they're responding rationally. The number of spots at selective schools has not increased. The number of jobs, good jobs for college grads, the payoff on getting a good paying college job is much higher than it used to be, than it was when I went to college. But the number of those jobs hasn't necessarily increased in line with the number of people who are graduating degrees. And so parents really totally rationally feel like, I've got to shove my kids through this. I've got to make sure they get to the best school possible and get the best grades and get the right major and all that, because they feel like there's no second chance if their kid doesn't get that job. And I think that's really exaggerated, actually, speaking as someone who's sort of failed mightily over and over again before I settled on a career in journalism. I think that there are more second chances than people think. But it's also the teachers are responding rationally, because what do the parents and kids do as they are in this high-stakes system is they litigate everything, right? So if you don't provide that rubric, if you don't tell them exactly what they have to do, then when a parent comes and contests a grade, you can't fall back. If you have a rubric, you can say, look, they didn't do these 3 things. Well, I mean, it's safe for everyone, but the problem is that then it stifles creativity, it stifles learning, it stifles exploring, it stifles all of the things that we think we need in order to have a productive and innovative society. And I would say also a happy society, right, is that coloring within the lines is great when you're 5, but we hope for more for adults in society, and we're increasingly stripping that away from people right at the time when they're supposed to be learning to do that the most.
Sure. So let's get into exactly what you mean by failing well, because the subtitle of your book is Why Failing Well is the Key to Success. And then an article you wrote the same year has a really provocative title of Go Ahead, Let Your Kids Fail. So we need to distinguish what we mean by failing well versus just failing as kind of a bad thing. That's
a really good question, and it's always so I'll start by just defining what failure is, because we often muddy that term up. I think that you can think of different things. You can think of like an accident, right, or a mistake, or a failure, and those are actually 3 different things, but we tend to muddle them up. And so the way I define it in the book is, look, an accident is something where something bad happened, but there's nothing you could do. You walk in the street and the piano falls in your head. Well, okay, you could say, I wish I'd stopped at Starbucks or whatever, but there was no actual rational reason for you to know that you needed to. There was no way to really, by better planning, avoid that outcome. It was bad luck. And so how do you fail well? Well, the first thing you do is recognize that. You recognize what happened. You look at it and you say, okay, here's the component of it that was bad luck, And here's the component of it that was me. So the first thing is recognizing. The second is looking at that failure, what parts were me and what parts were luck, what would I do differently next time. The third is moving on. And that's really often the hardest part, is saying I'm going to let it go. I've learned what I can from it, and now I'm not just going to sit around and beat myself up, or I'm not going to go look for someone else I can beat up because it's really all their fault. And part of that is assessing whether you should try doing the thing you were doing again or try doing something different. The question I get a lot, but also with I'm trying a class I'm not, it took me 3 times to master calculus, for example. And part of that really is looking at it and saying, so people always say, well, how do you know when you should try again, and how do you know when you should just quit? There's time and place for both. And the answer I always give is, look, if you can tell me why it didn't work last time and what you could plausibly do differently, then you're a good candidate for trying again. If you can't tell me why it didn't work, then you're not a good candidate for trying again. Because if you don't understand it, then you're not going to do anything differently, and you're not going to succeed next time.
You, in the book, you mention the work of Carol Dweck, the psychologist of education. So if we're talking about kind of knowing when to give up and knowing that failure doesn't necessarily mean that you're just going to sink, that if you do it right and if you learn from it, you can kind of rise up and go again. So explain how Carol Dweck's research comes in, because she's a really big name in education right now.
She is. So basically her idea is, like, there are 2 kinds of people. There are people who have what she calls a fixed mindset, which is that a challenge is like, it's a dipstick. It measures your existing level of talent. And other people who have what she calls a growth mindset, which is that a challenge is an opportunity to learn how to do something. This is really important because, especially actually a lot of bright students, I certainly had this problem as a writer. I was a really good writer when I was growing up. I was the kid who wrote a novel and a composition book when I was 8. It wasn't a very good novel, but I was 8. But I was always a better writer than most of the kids in my class. And the problem with that, actually, when you become a professional writer, and you see this over and over again, it's shocking how many professional writers get writer's block and how often it happens. And when you dig down into it, what it actually is, it's not laziness. I've watched, like, incredibly hardworking people almost torpedo their career through sheer just failure to turn stuff in. And so what happens for writers is, look, as long as you haven't written it, it's still perfect. But then when you start putting it down, it's never as good as it is in your head. And so people just keep not writing things as a way of delaying this experience of finding out they're not as good as they think they are. It's called self-handicapping, where you actually kind of hurt your efforts to do something in an effort to protect yourself from learning that you're not as talented as you thought you were. It's a tremendously damaging mindset. And in fact, it's also not true, right? You think about how you learn to play tennis, right? It's not a matter of, like, how smart, how good you are at math. If that were true, the MIT tennis team, right, would win Wimbledon every year. But no, in fact, it's about how many times have you practiced and how do you do it? You're bad at it. The first time most people play tennis, you hit the ball, it goes nowhere near where you are. And this is also true of people who go up to even famous tennis stars. It's the first time you don't know what you're doing. The way you figure it out is to be bad at it. And you hit the ball and it goes a little closer to where you want it, and eventually you learn how to hit a ball and do all of these things. But it's an enormous amount of practice. It's an enormous amount of time refinements. It's true of writing. It's true of getting good at any skill. And so what I always tell writers, young writers, when they're starting out, is they have to give themselves permission to suck. You have to literally write, and I use this all the time. This was the most painful thing for me to learn as a columnist when I started writing for The Atlantic, was absolutely this: you have to sit down and say, okay, this is going to be bad. But that was so freeing. Because before, what I had done was just sit there for weeks, waiting for, because as long as I hadn't written it, it was still good. And the worst part is that every writer has the experience periodically. They do get inspired, and they pour out something that is darn close to perfect. The first time they sit down, they write it, it's done. Maybe they do a little editing or whatever, but it's so close to perfect. And we all chase that. We all think that everything is supposed to be like that. Well, in fact, 99% of what I do, 99% of what any high-level professional does is iterating stuff that isn't as good over and over until it gets better. Most of it is not this brilliant inspiration.
I guess with schools, it seems to me oftentimes the way they're structured and the way the classes and the syllabi are structured, it's you kind of expect students to kind of be on all the time. Like, you turn in a project, and if you have a bad day with that project, well, there's 15% of your grade. And it seems like that kind of incentivizes in some ways, like you say in the book, kind of school becomes an act of pleasing adults for no apparent reason. And, you turn this in to please the adult, and then you turn the next thing in to please the adult.
instead of learning what you're capable of, and there's some of both, right? You do have to learn to please authority. Yes, but my parents were totally right about that in high school. That's part of it, right? Is hierarchy and authority is necessary to run a big modern society, and you got to learn to work in it. But, you know, one of the great teachers I had as an English major had a thing where you would turn in a bunch of papers, but not all of them counted. And it was great because it gave you so much, you know, it was, I think 3 out of 5 of them would count towards your final grade, or maybe it was 5 out of 7. And they weren't super long papers. But what was immense about it was that it gave you so much more room to experiment. Even just having a few fail-safes, right? Even just having a few, you have to turn on all of them. You'll get graded 0 if you don't turn anything in. But 2 of these, I'm just going to drop those grades. Well, okay, now I have a lot more room to try something. Now I have a lot more room to find out, you know, is there a new technique I might be better at? Is there some topic that I might want to look at that I don't know if I'm going to be able to get at writing about, et cetera? It was immensely freeing and a really immensely valuable experience.
When I gave my students your article, Go Ahead, Let Your Kids Fail, it was really eye-opening for them. They really hadn't thought of it that way before. It's, you know, how schools don't incentivize failure. But then a few of them said, but wait a minute, is there a line between allowing kids the space to fail and kind of permission in some ways to fail, and incentivizing failure in the wrong way? Because obviously you don't want your kids not to get better, but you also want to allow them room to fail. So is there a tension there? And do you have any ideas on kind of how we encourage giving kids the space to fail, but not necessarily incentivizing failure?
Everything is a trade-off, I would say, first of all, right? And what you don't want to do is make failure no cost. Right, that's what like a socialist state government where you have a state-owned firm that can't fail. You look at that firm, do they do a good job? No, why should they? They have no reason to do a good job. Nothing bad happens if they do a bad job, and doing a bad job is usually easier than doing a good job. So you don't want to end up in that situation either with kids in school or anywhere else in your personal life. On the other hand, the alternative to that is you look at things with our criminal justice system where, you know, once you've gotten a felony conviction, almost nothing can go right in your life. It's hard to get another job that isn't in crime. It's hard. That is the other end of that spectrum, and it's just as bad. Okay, well, why would I? Because, in fact, what's weird is it's almost like a U, right? Is you get the same outcome on both ends. There's no point in succeeding for me on the one hand because I won't be allowed, and on the other hand because I won't be rewarded. And so what you want in the middle is this. Failure should have costs. And the example I always use is bankruptcy law, right? Bankruptcy is actually, you would think from the way people treat it that it's really horrible. And so I actually went to the Memphis bankruptcy courts for a week. And you're expecting this to be this terrible, horrifying scene. And in fact, it's like traffic court. It's not even like traffic court. Traffic court is more emotionally fraught than the bankruptcy court. It's incredibly boring. Declaring bankruptcy is actually remarkably low cost in America. Almost nothing happens. Okay, your credit report gets trashed. You have to go to court. You have to pay a lawyer a few $1,000s. I'm not saying that these things are insignificant. They aren't. But compared to how many people could benefit from bankruptcy, compared to how many people use it, it's surprising. So what we have is actually that bankruptcy is costly. And a lot of that cost is not actually the process itself. It is the social stigma and the personal shame. And a lot of people have kind of argued for getting rid of the social stigma and the personal shame, but I actually don't think that's right. Because what those things do is actually allow us to have really cheap bankruptcy. So there is a cost to getting yourself in trouble. And almost everyone, there are some people who really didn't get themselves in trouble where just something terrible happened, they had a lawsuit against them or something. Most people you talk to in bankruptcy made bad decisions. And I want to say that saying, like, I've also made many bad decisions in my life. So it is possible to say most people in bankruptcy made bad decisions, and also making bad decisions is a very human thing to do. It's assuming that people in bankruptcy are special bad people who don't deserve as much as people who don't declare bankruptcy. So they've made bad decisions. Those bad decisions should be costly, but they should be costly in a specific way, which is that it should be painful psychically, and then you move on from it.
Yeah, you have a really good quote towards the end of your book that's kind of to that effect. I think it's really relevant for education. A resilient society lets you fail and even lets the failures sting, but only for a moment. Then it helps you get back on track and everyone reaps the benefit. It seems to me like you could almost use that in a teacher's manual about exactly how to give people the space to fail but not encourage failure. You let it sting. There's got to be some consequence to it that maybe that's negative. Otherwise, you're not going to learn anything.
Exactly.
but you kind of, you allow it to move on. So I feel like maybe the classroom analogy to that is, like I always try to tell my students, if you have a syllabus with several, quite a few assignments on it, don't make it so that any one of those assignments will make it impossible for you to pass the class.
Yeah, exactly. It's not that we should get rid of grades, but it's that there should be a lot of opportunities to improve.
Right.
There should also, frankly, be opportunities to say, you know what, I am just not good at this topic. Maybe it's, and there are people who are never going to pass calculus.
Yeah.
And to say, I tried, right? It should be easier to try. And then, to say, look, I've gotten halfway. It is clearly impossible for me to pass this course. I'm withdrawing rather than taking the F on my transcript.
Yeah. You also mentioned briefly in the book, sometimes the way we teach almost sends the message that failure isn't something that happens. When great people do great things, it's great. And kids maybe internalize that message to say, well, if I do something, it's not great. Then obviously I can't be any good at it. So can you talk a little bit about kind of your ideas on that and how we teach in a way that inadvertently sends that message?
Absolutely. So I'm going to give most examples from English because that is the I'm most familiar with, both as a producer of words and as a consumer of them, and an English major, but also in science. So when you think about how we teach English literature, right, is you find some authors and you pick their best books. And so what's interesting about Shakespeare is that he wrote an enormous number of plays, and almost every high school student has read like 1 of 5 of them. What's interesting about Mark Twain is that he wrote dozens of books, and almost every high school student has read 1 of 4 of them. And this is true over and over of writing, right? You pick the best possible book because you want to show people what really great literature. And I don't want to downgrade that because I do. I want people to be excited by great literature. The problem is that then what's the impression you get? Well, there are people who are just amazing genius writers, and then there's me. And in fact, one of the best courses I took in college was a course where we read everything Mark Twain wrote. And it turned out that Mark Twain wrote a lot of garbage. Now, his garbage was still better than my writing even on his bad days because he was a genius. But the distance was a lot lower. And so what you get, I still remember being at a conference of academics who were English majors. We were talking about Moby Dick. And so we're talking about one particular chapter. It's on, this is incredibly Dick, which is a very weird book. And there's a chapter on how you determine whether you're allowed to hunt a whale in the open sea. It's called a fast fish or a loose fish. A fast fish is when you can't hunt. A loose fish is when it's fair game. And at the end of the chapter, it says, this is wonderfully sort of pretentious line that says, and what are you, dear reader, but a fast fish and a loose fish too? And they're all talking about what that means and why he did it. And I raised my hand at some point and I said, I'm just going to throw this out here, but I think maybe he just needed to end the chapter and he thought that sounded good. And the look that these people gave me was as if I'd been like, hey guys, what if after this session were over, we just went out and mugged some old ladies? Well, any writer will tell you, we do this all the time. You just you're like, I have to turn this in. I have to stop. I don't really know what to say. Okay. Like, there's something, it sounds good. And that's just sort of the professional thing. And that's not the way that they thought about it, right? They're thinking about him as a genius who was doing genius things. And what we know is that even geniuses just write themselves in the corners and need to get out, and you sort of reach for a kind of glib a glib, good sounding line and slam it in and you're done. And so it's science too. Like, you think even we learn about the mistakes, you learn about Lamarckian evolution, you learn about all of these dead ends and mistakes that science made. Spontaneous combustion of mice is one that I think that most people remember from their high school science class. What you don't realize is that the way it's taught, these people sound like idiots, right? They thought that mice spontaneously generated. What you don't find out is that a lot of geniuses also believed in really dumb things. For example, Isaac Newton believed in alchemy, right? I mean, this is a lot of geniuses also went down these dumb. It wasn't because they were dumb, it was because they made mistakes. Even geniuses make mistakes. They do it often. They do it over and over again.
Which seems to, if you go back to Carol Dweck's research, I guess, is a remarkable way to inadvertently instill in children that the fixed mindset. Right? Yeah, yeah. I mean, even as a teacher, I remember in high school, one of my biggest mistakes as a high school teacher, I think, was being afraid to tell students, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure. Let's figure out the answer to that. As a teacher, you always feel like all eyes are on you. So you have to know exactly what you're doing, and you have to be the authority figure always in the room. And I guess
when we're on panels or on television, it's the same thing. It's so painful to say, you know what? I actually just don't know.
Right, right. Yeah. And so the last question I have for you is, again, going back to your article, Go Ahead and Let Your Kids Fail. In that article, we meet a 10th grade girl that you had run into after giving a talk about kind of the virtues of failure as a learning opportunity. And she says, I really like your message, but here's the thing. I'm an international baccalaureate, and I have to have a certain GPA, and everyone else is going to have this GPA, and I don't feel like I can take a class that I might enjoy and get something out of because I might fail it. So the question is, have you figured out what it is that we can tell her or her parents or her teachers that might potentially help the situation and give this student a little bit more confidence that, yeah, the world won't fall if I misstep along the way?
Yeah, I would say two things. There's a great Adam Smith quote, "There's a lot of ruin in a nation," which he always gave, which is, people assume it means that, nations get ruined. It's actually the opposite. What he says is when people are saying the sky is falling, the nation's on the verge of being extinguished. And there's, in fact, nations are often on the verge of being extinguished, and they aren't. All of these things that you think are terrible may be terrible. They're not necessarily going to destroy society. And it's also true of your life, is that especially at that age, you think, oh God, it's over. Everything is over. I'm the worst person in the world. I'm the biggest failure. And it's not true. I was living at home, 30 years old. I remember my sister coming to me and saying, my life is over. I don't know what to do, etc. I started laughing. She was 28. I was like, Nora, when I was 30, I was living in our parents' spare bedroom. Relax. You have more time than you think to figure it out. And that is really, really true. But I also think that we need to lower the stakes for those kids. We need to lower them for two reasons. It's bad for poor kids who can't get through the system, and it's bad for the kids at the top who get through the system only by kind of behaving like trained rats in mazes. We don't need an elite that's really, really good at running through the same maze over and over again. And we do need more opportunity for the kids at the bottom who don't have the immense social capital to push themselves through the maze in the first place.
Sure. Great. Well, with that, I want to thank you again for taking out the time to talk to us about how your research connects with the idea of failure as a part of the learning process. So, thank you.